Joining us now on Waterloo Live is Severine Angers, PhD researcher at the University of York and a specialist on families and their reactions to grief during the period. Severine, welcome. What were the social expectations of families in mourning? Were there any sort of conventions that they had to adhere to?
At the time, yes, but mourning in the 18th century and early 19th century, it's much simpler than the big mourning rituals of the Victorian era. So one thing that we would see was family would close the curtains of their house when a death occurred, so just to inform people there had been a death, and they would remain closed until the funerals usually. In time of mourning, when they would send letters, usually they would use a black seal. There was a black outline on paper, so that was one way to inform of the state of bereavement that they were in. And we do also find some mourning clothes that families would wear. Gloves were a big one, scarves, and most commonly people would wear ring. They were hugely popular at the time. So mourning rings were usually made with using hair from the deceased. So it was really a very personalized memorial that they would use. And also, well, they would restrain their social life in the few months following that, like not going dancing, usually things like that. But it's still quite simple. But we're seeing a movement towards the big rituals of mourning of the Victorian era.
So for military families, how would they have actually heard of their loss? Do they have to wait to read it in the newspapers? And how does that differ for the rank and file who obviously weren't listed in the newspapers? So you haven't got that reference point.
Yeah, so for officers, yes, as you said, newspaper were one of the main way that families could learn about the death. So mostly the London Gazette, so all wounded and fallen officers were listed in it, and it really became rituals for military families in Britain that they would eagerly read a newspaper, hoping not to find the name of their loved one. And that's one thing that officers on the battlefield are very much aware of. And when death occurs, their fellow officers tend to write to the families of their fallen comrade to give them the news in a more gentler way than simply reading a name in a newspaper. And that's something that they explicitly write, like, I'm writing, hoping this will reach you before you have time to read it in the newspaper. So letters really play a pivotal part in informing families of officers of their loss. Now, when it comes to the rank and file, as you said, they can't rely on a newspaper at all. So, and there's no official system to inform families of the rank and file of their death. So unlike the two world wars, when there's the telegram that is sent, there's this whole rituals really that appears. There's no such thing during the Napoleonic Wars. So what we can see is that times commanding officers could write to families of the men that were under their commands, but they don't always have the time. And when they do write, it's usually a very brief letter. So soldiers could also write to families of their fallen comrades, but of course the literacy rate of in the rank and file is much lower than in the officer corps. But that's one thing that we see, and I've found one collection where there was a pact really between soldiers, like, if I die, you write to my family, and the opposite too. So that's another way, letters. And finally, families could inquire to the War Office. So by the end of the 1790s, so the War Office required officers to list all fallen soldiers in their rank, but they would not give the information to the families. They had to go and ask for it. So you have some official forms family could fill out and send it, and hoping for an answer about the fate of their loved one.
Does that happen very often? Is there a lot of uptake for that service, or is that something that a lot of people don't actually even know about?
I'm thinking some don't even know about it, because I found one in a collection of letter that was this form there. And since it was from the War Office, I thought, oh, there must be multiple ones, at the National Archives. But no, there wasn't. I've checked and checked. So yeah, have to look more into it, but I'm sort of thinking that's not a service that might have been used as much as it could have been.
And is there a phenomenon of that sort of last letter home that we sort of romanticize about a bit? You talked about how literacy isn't widespread amongst the rank and file. Obviously, do we have a lot of instances of people kind of doing that sort of slightly Hollywood thing of taking a letter and going, give this to my loved one, sort of thing? Is that a thing during the period?
Um, I haven't found, a letter that was written in the provision of if I die, you give this, but they do prepare their death because they know, they're going to battle. Also, there's the threat of disease that is there, so they know death is a very likely possibility. So yeah, they do ask, if I die, give this, my helmet or my that object to that member of my family. So I've found some last wishes that they would ask to their fellow comrades.
I want to talk about the burial process or lack of
Mm-hmm.
burial process, because we talked about funerals earlier. The whole point of a funeral is that you're meant to bury your loved one's remains. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, if somebody dies in a theatre overseas, you can't do that. There is very little in the way of repatriation. Nelson is actually an outlier in
Mm-hmm.
that sense when his body is brought back. How does that affect the mourning process? Because it's kind of a bit unusual to have
Mm-hmm.
a funeral without a body. So do they hold funerals with empty coffins? Is there a sort of an effort to bury a loved one, or do they have to kind of go without a funeral and therefore find other ways to mourn?
What I've found is that they have to find other ways to mourn. I haven't found so far any instances of families that had a funeral without a body. So they might have had a memorial service at church. I assume there were some, but yeah, no, not being able to have a funeral, it's a major disruption to the usual mourning process. Also, there's not the possibility of assisting the loved one in his last moments, so you have no idea how did he die? Did he have a good death? Was it painful? And also, that's um, one thing that families are really eager to know, like how did the last moment happen? Um, and having a body really to mourn brought a tangibility to death. It helps to bring a closure, resolution of grief. So without that, family had to experience mourning to an extent in a mediated fashion through the letters that they received from the front. So um, they would ask fellow soldiers or officers about details, how did he die? Where was there a burial? And there's really an insistence in letters that officers sent home uh, the burial, if it was possible to have one on the battlefield. That's one thing that officers tended to have much more than the rank and file, of course. So, but that knowledge, just knowing that the body has been buried appears to have been very, very comforting to bereaved families because then they're not left contemplating, the idea of the body of their loved one being left to nature without care. So that distance really between the front and home deeply informed that mourning process. They had to find new ways to remember, new like locus of remembrance, because when you have a grave, you can go there and, oh, the person is there. It really helps. When you don't have that possibility, you have to adjust. And that's when objects really will come to take a much deeper meaning. It embodies, the deceased person, those objects that once belonged to the loved one.
Well, let's stay with that kind of theme then. How do families try and go through that process of keeping the memory of their loved ones alive?
Yes, so as we just mentioned, yeah, objects, they really play an enormous part in it. They bear a new significance in mourning. They act like as a surrogate for the death, and they they become a focus for the grief, consolation, and remembrance. And objects really have long been associated with mourning. There were some sort of rituals like making jewelry, like rings with the hair of the deceased or lockets, also with the hair. But you can't do that when you don't have a body, so you need to find new objects. So some that were very mostly used by families were watches if they had miniatures object, but anything really could become a memorial. It's the mother of Major Edward Cox, who died at Burgos. She kept every single object that had once like been touched or belonged to her fallen son, and she turned one room of their house into a memorial temple to her fallen son. So it's very poignant to read about how a childhood drawing could become a memorial under those circumstances. And letters too that the soldiers had sent were turned into private memorials. So that's one thing families would hold on to very dearly, because letters, it's a tangible evidence of the intimate relationship that they shared with the loved ones. So they had been touched at times. It's mentioned that they had kissed the letters even. So it's very tangible proof of that affective ties they had with the disease. Then there's the interesting case of Captain John Lucy Blackman, who died at Waterloo in the last moment of the battle at Hougoumont, and his elder brother, George, he kept all the letters of his fallen brother. He annotated them even in the decades following that. So you have notes from the 1840s there, so you can tell that he came back to the letters of his brother, annotated them. So it became a sort of ritual for him to look at the letters of his fallen brother.
I also want to ask about support networks, both kind of financial and emotional. What is there, particularly for widows and orphans during this period, to help them through this process?
Yes, so there's not much before the beginning of the war, but the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, it's really a period of transition, because there are so many families that are affected by the wars, that there's this new awareness. Okay, we actually need to do something. So there's but between like what you want to do and what you can actually do, usually there's a big gap. But already in 1793, there's a new charity that is established. It's a private one, so it's the United Society for the Relief of Widows and Children of Seamen, Soldiers, and Married who may fall during the wars. And members of the royal family, like the Prince of Wales and the Duke of York, were patrons of that organization. So that's one, but it's still a private initiatives. You have the Foundling Hospital in London that would take care of orphans of soldiers, but they had limited resources, so they could not, unfortunately, admit all of them. We find some attempts, of officers writing to the War Office, we need to put on a scheme, to help, but also it's a period where taxes are already very, very high, so it's not very popular to ask even more financial aid. So there's the desire to help more, but even during the wars, we don't see a long-term financial scheme for these orphans of widows. So they still often rely on poor relief on their familial relative next war for both financial and emotional support. For widows that are in the regiment, so that followed the army on campaign, the regiment became a very strong emotional support. So there was a sort of moral obligation at times on the soldiers' part to take care of the widows and children of their fallen comrades. So we find them remarry very, very quickly within the regiment. So that's an unofficial support network that existed too.
And for people who've died and obviously they leave objects behind, do we have this image of their items being auctioned off and that money going to the widow to support her and the family? Is that accurate? Is there any evidence of that really happening?
Yes, there's if a soldier died and some money was due to him, there was the possibility of the family asking for that money. And there are huge records. It's very thick books at the National Archives at Kew, and it's all list of all the fallen soldiers, how much money was due to him, and who was the next of kin that that money was due to. And when that money had been given to the family, we find a sort of little receipt, that what had been signed by the next of kin. So that's one thing that happens. The money that was due to the family, the pay of the soldier, but also some object that had been sold to auction.
Severine Angers, PhD researcher at the University of York. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you for joining us on Waterloo
Thanks for
Live.
having me.